So nervous system part 3 is looking at the peripheral nervous system. So far we studied nervous tissue. We looked at the different cells of the nervous system, like the ependymal cells, astrocytes, microglial cells, Schwann cells, oligodendrocytes. We talked about their role in helping nervous tissue, but the boss of the nervous system, the functional unit of the nervous system, is the neuron, right? So that's the nerve cells that actually conduct the signals and make the nervous system what it is, which is a very important control center for homeostasis. So we divide it into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of what two major organs? Brain and spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system is the other part, which are the cranial and spinal nerves. So they come off of the brain, and they're the highways of information for incoming information to the brain and spinal cord and outgoing information to the brain and spinal cord. Question? Yes, because in the beginning of the notes on the nervous system, remember we had that flow chart, which was looking at how the nervous system is organized. So let's go back and just refresh our memory on that. It's way back in the beginning. Right here. So just kind of a generic overview is how we started the class. We had the central nervous system made up of the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system was the cranial and spinal nerves. So we spent a lot of time here, and that's what the first nervous system 1 and 2 is looking at: brain functions, action potential, nervous tissue, nerve cells, all that stuff. So now we're going to move into this division and really analyze this part. So to effectively do that, I think it's worth taking time to talk about the spinal cord. And you're going to look at that in lab this week, but unfortunately our lab doesn't meet until after lecture, so it's always best to do lab material before lecture material. That way you know the parts before you talk about what their functions are. So it's just a little bit, makes a little bit more sense when you do it that way. But sometimes we get out of sequence. So I want to talk about the spinal cord and look at those few slides real quickly here. Sorry if I'm making you dizzy by all this flipping around. So let's go back to this page in your notes, looking at the spinal cord. So the spinal cord has nerves coming off of it. So here's the beige round structure is the spinal cord, and then it has a nerve leading to it, but the nerve is actually out here. It's kind of like a two-lane highway. Look at, there's 4 different neurons. See, these are axons here. 4 different axons carrying different types of information, all passing through the same spinal nerve. So a nerve is a collection of axons extending away from the brain or spinal cord, part of the peripheral nervous system. So we can see this is a mixed nerve, mixed meaning there's sensory neurons in there and there's motor neurons in there. So as that spinal nerve gets close to the spinal cord, it divides into 1-lane highways, kind of like the road in La Crosse, right? Copeland Avenue, is that a 2-lane or is that a two-way, 2-direction or 1-direction road? And then it branches into Rose Street, right? So Rose and Copeland, part 1 is, I don't even remember which one it is, I don't pay attention, but 1 is a 2-lane to both directions, and then it branches into a 1-way. So that's how our spinal nerves are. They're 2-lane highways, and then we have sensory information going this way. So if this is our spinal cord and this is the back of the spinal cord, this is called the dorsal root because it's attaches to the back side of the spinal cord. And this is the ventral root attaching to the front side of the spinal cord. But if we could add arrows here, the information flow, the sensory information, comes in only through the dorsal horn. So put some arrows on that blue and green neuron. In your notebook, it might be just black and white, but just put arrows showing that it's going into the spinal cord. So the sensory pathway comes into the spinal cord through the dorsal root. The other one, the ventral root, is the motor response. It's the response that's been sent from the brain or spinal cord back out to some organ out here that is waiting for a response. So put arrows going away from the spinal cord on the ventral root. So the ventral root is away, and the dorsal root is toward. Another name for these terms is afferent, efferent. Afferent arrives to the spinal cord, and efferent exits the spinal cord. So you can think of afferent arriving, efferent exiting. You might see those terms, afferent, efferent. But we can say sensory for the dorsal, motor for the ventral. So it's a divided highway here. So all spinal nerves are mixed nerves, meaning they contain both sensory and motor axons. So if you damage a nerve, you might have sensory problems, which means numbness or tingling, or you might have motor problems, which would be weakness or paralysis, because that's the response, right? So we're going to look at these nerves in a lot of detail. So where did this information come from with the sensory? It came from a sensory receptor. Something out in the peripheral nervous system, some organ out there that has sensory receptors attached to it. We have sensory receptors in our skin, and those are specialized dendrites, right? Aren't dendrites the receiving part of a neuron? So when you look at sensory neurons, they're a special kind of neuron called a unipolar neuron, because look at where the cell body is located. It's right in the center. And look at the swelling that's located there. A swelling of cell bodies outside the central nervous system is called a ganglion. So that swelling there is called the dorsal root ganglion, because it's a collection of cell bodies of sensory neurons. If we see a collection of cell bodies inside the brain and spinal cord, that's called a tract. Remember we had the olfactory tract and the olfactory nerve when we looked at the sheep brain? If it's part of the brain, it's olfactory tract. It's cell bodies. I'm sorry. No, those are axons. No, it's I said that wrong. I apologize. A collection of cell bodies outside the nervous system is called a ganglion. A collection of cell bodies inside the central nervous system is called a horn. Okay? It's called a horn. So we're going to see that in the spinal cord. See the butterfly-looking shape? These are called horns. So what do you think this horn is called, because it's connected to the dorsal root? Dorsal horn. There's two of them. This is connected to the ventral root, so these two here are ventral horns. This one is on the side. This is called the lateral horn. And if you look at the color coding, each of these has neurons of a different type. So the dorsal horn has sensory, somatosensory, so sensory information coming in from the somatic nervous system, from skeletal muscles, okay? So for body position and things like that. This is visceral sensory, which means it's coming from organs, like your heart. Signals coming in from the heart would come into this region, still in the dorsal horn, but a little lower in the dorsal horn. Visceral motor, this is the autonomic nervous system. So visceral is organs, motor response, so a response to organs like speeding up the heart or dilating a blood vessel. Though it's these yellow axons that carry that information, and that's the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, controlling smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, which are part of the autonomic nervous system. And then these red ones are part of the ventral horn. This is somatic motor. So when you kick a ball, catch a ball, write with your pencil, those neurons exit the spinal cord at the ventral horn. That's the cell body. So they receive information. These have dendrites to receive information to go out to the spinal nerve and stimulate that muscle or organ. Okay, so the swelling here is because of the cell bodies there. Is this area myelinated? Are the cell bodies myelinated? No. The axons are. So this side has the dendrites for receiving information. This side has sensory receptors, this sensory neuron here, to the skin, to the eye, to the nose, to the mouth, right? All those special sensations we receive are found at the end of this blue sensory neuron. So they're out here gathering information. Okay, so we have 31 pairs of these spinal nerves, so they come off the spinal cord. We have 12 pairs of cranial nerves that come off the brain. Again, with specialized sensory receptors bringing information into the brain or spinal cord, and then they have motor neurons going out to give a response. So if we label all these parts and kind of take away what's going on inside, here's my spinal nerve, and then it divides the dorsal root ganglion, part of the dorsal root, and then the neurons that make up the ventral root don't have a cell body in the middle. They're a typical multipolar neuron that we looked at and labeled in the first couple pages of this nervous system unit. They don't have a cell body in the middle. It's at the end with the dendrites like we saw in lab. So that's the outgoing, the motor response. And then we have these meninges, just like we saw in the brain. We have the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater tightly adhered. And there's a little hole in the center of the spinal cord called the central canal for cerebral spinal fluid to go down the middle. And then again, we have this gray matter, which are cell bodies and dendrites of those different neurons we talked about. And then the white part, these are called tracts. So myelinated axons outside the central nervous system are called nerves. Myelinated axons within the central nervous system are called tracts. So this is called the posterior tract or posterior column. You can think of them as columns or are white typically, right? And like the White House has those 4 columns. So we could call this the posterior column, lateral columns, anterior columns. They're the axons that are going to head up the spinal cord. Okay, so gray matter, cell bodies and dendrites. And again, it's called a ganglion if it's outside the brain or spinal cord. If it's inside the brain or spinal cord, like in this case, these are called horns. And again, we'll review that again in the lab portion. So now that we have a little bit of background, just refreshing our memory of how these nerves play a role and travel into the spinal cord, we'll talk about a little bit more details. So we're focusing on this part of the organization that I showed you in the first couple of slides. So the peripheral nervous system, there's information coming in through sensory neurons and going out through motor neurons, and that going out could either be controlling skeletal muscle, which is under voluntary control, or it could be the autonomic nervous system looking at cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. And again, that autonomic response for homeostasis can be a revving up, a fight or flight, or it can be a rest and digest. Okay, so if we look at the sensory receptors, there's different types. Mechanoreceptors actually have to have a morphing of the membrane. There has to be some type of movement of the membrane. So when we look at mechanoreceptors, if there's pressure stimulating these receptors, those are different sensory receptors, but they're still mechano. They're recognizing pressure. Vibration is another type of receptor. Light touch, another type. Stretching of the skin, it's another type of receptor. So these are all below the epidermis. They have different names. I do not need you to know the different names. That is not critical information for anybody to know unless you were maybe a neurosurgeon dealing with skin paresthesias or numbness and tingling. So all you need to know is what a mechanoreceptor is. It just can detect changes at the surface. And the cell membranes change, they morph a little bit. They change in their shape. And then it stimulates these sensory receptors. So these are specialized dendrites to pick up these sensations: stretch, touch, vibration, or pressure. Thermoreceptors, what do you think they detect? What would you guess? Temperature changes, yeah. So either cold or hot. I'll bet you everybody who took a shower this morning felt the water before they stepped in. Would you say yes? Would you agree with that? Yeah. So you have, in your fingertips, you can tell if it's hot or cold because of the thermoreceptors. Photoreceptors, where would we find those? In the eye, in the back of the retina. Chemoreceptors, they detect chemicals dissolved in a solution. Where do you think those are found? In the nose and the tongue. And then nociceptors, no idea, right? What does noci mean? Noci means pain. So these are specialized to send signals of pain. So we want to shut those receptors down, right, as much as we can in a hospital setting where there's been surgery or injury or inflammation, damage to tissues. We want to try to calm that down. But do we want to eliminate pain completely? Would it be good for our body not to feel pain at all? What is the benefit of nociceptors for the human body? Right. Yeah, if I hurt myself, I'm going to stop doing that, right? So nociceptors are protective. So would it be smart if you were designing this human body to adapt nociceptors, that if there's a lot of chronic pain, let's just understimulate that one and let's just shut that one down? It'd be great if you had arthritis to be able to shut it down, right, with just by adapting to the pain. No, we don't ever adapt nociceptors because it's a protective thing for us. We don't want them to adapt. They do not just go away. So if someone has a chronic pain condition, it's not going to get better. They don't just get used to the pain. They can cope with the pain, but they don't not feel it anymore because that would not be helpful to the body. So nociceptors, the good news is some of these sensory neurons, when they come in, they combine and they travel the same pathway to the brain for perception. So what do you do when you bang your funny bone? What is the first response if you bang your funny bone? What do? You rub it, you go, oh. Why do we rub it? What do we know about rubbing? Makes it feel better, doesn't it? Because you're stimulating mechanoreceptors that go to the same part of the brain that block out the signal. Because pain is like a traffic. If you sit on Highway 16 and a motorcycle comes by, you hear the motorcycle, right? But if you have a motorcycle and a bus and a taxi cab and a loud sports car all traveling at the same time, do you hear the motorcycle as well? No. So if I add pressure and temperature, warm, if I add heat and massage to a painful area, does that decrease our perception of the pain? If you had a bad headache and someone came behind you and rubbed your shoulders and neck, is it like, oh my gosh, my headache is gone? And then they stop and the headache comes right back, right? So that's why as nurses and future healthcare workers and family members and our own selves, taking care of ourselves, if we can confuse our receptors a little bit by adding extra stimulation, we don't have to give so many pain meds. Because what do? Just throw oxycodone at everybody, right? Shut down the nervous system to deal with the pain. Sometimes people get adapted to that, to the medicine, not to the pain, where they need higher and higher doses, and now they're addicted, and we have a big mess going on societally. We do. Because that's the #1 reason for the heroin addiction, right, is it starts with oxycodone and narcotic pain meds, and then it gets out of control, and they resort to heroin because they can't get access to narcotic pain meds. So we have to really be careful with narcotics. And nurses are in the driving seat, doctors of course too, but nurses are at the bedside, and they're the ones that are requesting or receiving the requests for the pain meds. So if we can confuse the receptors saying, you know what, you already had some oxy, we're trying to get you off those medicines because it's not something you take normally. How about if I give you a hot pack? Or how about some ice on that? Or how about if we change your position and get you off that and just kind of get you moving a little bit? There's other things we can do than just throw pills at people, right? So we can classify these sensory receptors that are out there bringing in information to the spinal cord. So exteroceptors, those are ones that are exposed to the outside. So these are sensory receptors that are detecting getting stimulated by the outside stimulus. So all of our sensory receptors, touch, light, taste, sound, those are all due to stimulus from outside the body. Does that make sense? Extero, exit, outside, exterior, right? Interoceptors, those are receptors that are inside the body. For example, When you have receptors for blood sugar, and blood sugar is getting too high, that's inside the body stuff, right? We're not getting sugar thrown at us from the outside. That's inside the body. When the pressure is going up in our blood vessels, they reflexively dilate. Or when oxygen levels go down in the body, they reflexively dilate to increase blood flow to an organ. So those are interoreceptors. They're responding to changes inside the body, not stimuli from outside the body. Does that make sense? And proprioceptors are kind of a different thing. They are receptors that come in from muscle and joints and tell us if we're standing or sitting. And they tell us, some are conscious, some are unconscious. They tell us when we need to contract a muscle to keep us doing what we're doing. Like if you passed out right now, you probably may not be sitting in your chair. You might slump over forward or sideways or backward, depending on how you're sitting right now. So we have this unconscious signaling back and forth from proprioceptors and then going back out to muscle to stimulate and keep our body position where it's at. So proprioception, just think of position, body position, coming in from muscle and joints. So when you look at the nerves, remember we looked at this in lab already, they're bundles of myelinated axons outside the brain and spinal cord. So you want to highlight or underline the word outside. And the word nerve and neuron is not the same thing. We talked about that in lab. A neuron is a single nerve cell. A nerve is just a bundle of axons. So it's part of many neurons all bundled together with myelin for conducting action potentials very quickly to and from the spinal cord. So we have nerves that come off the brain and we have nerves that come off the spinal cord. 12 pairs here, 31 pairs here. So a reflex is a quick highway for an action potential to travel. So if you step on something sharp, so here's the stimulus, you step on something sharp, it morphs the membrane of the skin, which stimulates these mechanoreceptors to send a pain signal through a sensory neuron. Remember, that has the cell body in the middle. Looks a little different. So it sends it into the dorsal root, to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. But rather than take time and go up to the brain and have us say, ouch, that hurts, I think I'll lift my foot up now, that takes too long. We want to protect that precious foot from being pierced by something sharp. So rather than waiting for a response from the brain, because it does go up to the brain, but the signal, the action potential, jumps over from the dorsal horn over to the ventral horn via the special neuron called an interneuron, like an interstate. Inter means between. So it jumps right over and causes a response to an effector organ. An effector is just the response, what's going to happen. So if we're stepping on something, this would be the muscles of the leg, which would contract. So that muscle at the arrow there would contract the hamstring to pull, and it would relax the quadricep on the front to pull that foot away from that sharp object. So that's a protective thing. So if it was your finger touching a hot stove, like Nate said, we'd want to pull that away quickly. So what's the effector organ then to pull my finger away? What does that motor neuron stimulate? What muscle shortens? The bicep will shorten, and what will be inhibited to lengthen? What's on the other side of the bicep? The tricep. The tricep will be inhibited, will not receive an action potential to make sure that it lengthens to pull that arm away. That gives us that instantaneous reflex that the brain didn't control. Now the action potential does get there, and it tells us, ouch, that was hot, or ooh, that was sharp, right? So we're aware of it, but the response happens even before we get the chance to do it voluntarily, okay? Because of the interneuron. This is the key part of this reflex arc. That's why it's called a reflex. You don't think about it. Just like when someone taps your knee, taps the patellar tendon, and your knee kicks out, that was without the brain being aware, because we have this interneuron to get that immediate response. And again, that's good for protection. It gives us the ability to quickly stop and pull up our foot before too much damage occurs.
We do have some level of control
No. 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 Now, can we become less sensitive to things like a loud sound, like a pow? Now, if you're not used to that, boom, the superior and inferior colliculi of the midbrain respond, one of those, I forget which one, responds to auditory stimuli that makes us jump, right? But if you continually receive that, the receptors for hearing do adapt. So people can get, is that what you're meaning? Okay, yeah. That is something that we can override. But reflexes, you know, that are tactile, I guess, you know, yeah, because sensory receptors can adapt. Not for pain, but they can, or I should say they adapt more slowly. Pain receptors can adapt more slowly, I guess, because it's, you know, mind over matter, right? People can override information coming in. Like if you're in the military, you're going to hear gunfire all the time, right? I have an issue with so much noise in my home, with having 6 kids and lots of activity all the time. There's something that nurses get called alarm fatigue. And on our floor, we get alarms going off for everything. You know, oxygen levels are low, or the CO2 meter on someone with an epidural is too high. Someone just wiggled in bed and set off their bed alarm, and it goes bloop, 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 and then it stops. Or it goes bloop, 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 and continues, and we all go running down the hallway, and the CNA is in the room and just forgot to disconnect the bed alarm before she helped a patient to the bathroom. So it happens so often that after a while you're kind of like, meh, and you just continue to work at the nurse's station. And what happens? People are falling, oxygen levels are dropping, so we have to help each other with alarm fatigue. It doesn't make you a bad nurse if you get alarm fatigue. It just means you're in the environment and your brain is adapting to those auditory signals that it hears all the time. You work in critical care, right? Is that a problem?
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They don't let us work in central monitoring for more than 6 hours at a time.
Yeah, because all those monitors. Yeah, yeah, and you need to be on your game, right? Yeah. So here's an example of the withdrawal reflex. So we have a pin, heaven forbid, stepping on. I think more typical is a Lego in my house at nighttime. Or heaven forbid, I feel like it's a reflex when you step in something wet or mushy. If you have pets in the house, then you're like, oh. So that becomes a new stimulus for the reflex. But the information comes in through the sensory neuron. There's the dorsal horn, right? Or not horn, ganglion. Comes in, goes up to the brain, but again, notice that it branches off, because there's more than one neuron here. Some go to the interneuron, and comes right back out and stimulates that hamstring to contract, pulling your foot away. But, so if we're going to lift up a foot, what about the other leg? That other leg better be stimulated to catch you or you're going to fall, right? So with the withdrawal reflex, only describes half of the reflex. It's just talking about the muscle that's being contracted to pull the limb away. And if it's your arm, no big deal. But if you're walking, you better have some stimulus to that other leg to catch you. And this one is well, this just describes it more. Reciprocal innervation means we need to inhibit the other muscle, the quadriceps, right, to allow the hamstring to contract and bend the leg away. So, but this one, the crossed extensor, if we're going to lift the one leg up, we better cross over to the other side of the spinal cord where the other neuron is going to the leg, and we better put that leg down. So if I'm walking along and I suddenly need to, and I'm stepping, and I suddenly pull this one up with a reflex, this one better drop and contract to hold me upright. So that's why we call it the crossed extensor. We have to extend the other leg. And what is the key thing? I've bolded and underlined and asked you, why do you think it's bolded and underlined? Right. It's an important piece of information. Because we can analyze all this stuff and follow the neurons, you know, and be in a graduate level class, but if you don't see the big picture of why do we need this reflex, they keep us from tripping. It's pretty amazing, actually, if you think of how well designed we are for this kind of stuff. Oh, look at that, Even said it was amazing. So the last little bit, I think we're going to take a break in the video here, and I'll pick up with the last part in the next